One inmate inside this prison carried out the deadliest terror attack in British history. Another became Scotland's most feared serial killer, and another was convicted after years of warnings about his violence were ignored. This prison is HMP Barlinnie. Known as the Big Hoose, it's one of the most infamous prisons in Scotland and has housed some of the country's most dangerous offenders. But after 142 years, Barlinnie is now preparing to close its doors for good. The prison is being replaced by a new so-called super jail known as HMP Glasgow, also being built in the city's East End, as Barlinnie itself has now become chronically overcrowded and increasingly outdated. Unlike some maximum security prisons, Barlinnie mainly operates as a remand prison, holding men awaiting trial or sentencing, alongside inmates serving shorter sentences. Because of that, it can become difficult to know exactly who is currently being held inside these walls at any given time. So in this video, we'll be looking at inmates known to have either served time inside Barlinnie or who were held here on remand, awaiting trial. A serial killer once stood amongst police officers and told them, "I'm standing on her now." A man many believe may have murdered far more people than anyone ever proved. This is the case of Peter Manuel, also known as the Beast of Birkenshaw. Peter Manuel was born in New York after his parents emigrated from Scotland, hoping for a better life. But when his father became seriously ill, the family were forced to return to the UK. Peter was only around 5 years old at the time and apparently struggled to fit in due to his American accent. But long before the murders began, there were already signs that something was deeply wrong. At just 15 years old, Peter carried out his first known violent attack, assaulting a sleeping woman with a hammer. Over the following years, he repeatedly attacked women and committed sexual assaults, spending periods in prison before being released back into the community. Then in January 1956, Scotland became gripped by one of the largest murder investigations that the country had ever seen. A man was out walking on the East Kilbride golf course and made a horrifying discovery. The body of 17-year-old Anne Nealance. Her head had been battered with an iron bar, and evidence at the scene suggested she had desperately tried to escape, running more than 400 yards before she was killed. She had also been sexually assaulted. Peter Manuel quickly became a suspect. He already had convictions for rape, and colleagues and investigators noticed scratches on his face dating back to the same night that Anne disappeared. But Peter's father gave him an alibi, and police couldn't prove that he was responsible. Not long after, a series of disturbing break-ins began taking place. Homes were ransacked in really bizarre ways. Tins of food were emptied across kitchen floors, and muddy footprints were left on beds before jewellery and cash were stolen. Then, on the 17th of September 1956, police were called to a house in Fensbank Avenue, near Glasgow. Inside, they found 45-year-old Marion Watt, her 16-year-old daughter Vivian, and Marion's sister Margaret Brown. All three had been shot dead in their beds. The killer had broken the glass panel in the front door before entering the house during the night. Later evidence would also reveal that 16-year-old Vivian had been sexually assaulted. At first, suspicion fell on Marion's husband, William Watt, who was away on a fishing trip at the time. Police believed that he may have secretly travelled home during the night, carried out the murders, then returned to Argyll to secure an alibi. William was imprisoned in Barlinnie for 67 days before the case against him completely collapsed due to lack of evidence. And during that same period, Peter Manuel was also in prison for housebreaking. But while William was sat locked inside Barlinnie, accused of murdering his own family, Peter began sending bizarre, taunting letters to William's lawyer, claiming that another inmate had confessed the murders to him. while including details that only the real killer could have known. That's when suspicion finally started shifting towards Peter himself. But even then, it still wasn't enough to stop him. After being released from prison, Peter killed again. On the 29th of December 1957, 17-year-old Isabel Cook disappeared. Her shoes and handbag were later discovered in a river, but with no body and no real leads, the investigation quickly stalled. Then just weeks later, another horrific discovery was made. On the 6th of January 1958, police were called to a bungalow in Uddingston after 45-year-old Peter Smart failed to show up for work that morning. Inside, officers found Peter Smart, his wife Doris, and their 11-year-old son Michael, all shot dead in their beds. But what disturbed investigators most was what neighbours reported afterwards. For days after the family had likely been killed, neighbours claimed that they'd seen the curtains opening and closing, and lights turning on and off inside the house. Detectives began to suspect the killer had either remained inside the home with the bodies, or kept returning to the scene unnoticed. Peter Manuel was finally arrested after stolen banknotes belonging to the Smart family were traced back to him, being spent in local bars. But then came one final twist. Peter's father, Samuel, was arrested after stolen property from another burglary was discovered in his room. Peter then offered police a deal. If they released his dad, he would confess to the murders, reveal where Isabel Cook was buried, and show officers where he'd dumped the murder weapons used in both the Watt and the Smart family killings. When detectives took Peter to where he claimed to have buried Isabel Cook, Peter reportedly looked at the ground beneath his feet and calmly said, "I'm standing on her now." Peter Manuel eventually confessed to 8 murders, making him Scotland's most prolific mass murderer at the time. But despite confessing, he was only convicted of 7. The murder of Anne Nealance was reported as not proven, even after his admission. It took the jury just 2 hours and 21 minutes to sentence him to death. On the 11th of July 1958, Peter Manuel was executed by hanging inside Barlinnie Prison. He was 31 years old at the time. But even after his death, many believed his true victim count was far higher. One possible victim was Northumberland taxi driver Sidney Dunn, who was shot dead in December 1957, while Peter was reportedly in the northeast, searching for work. There was suspicion, but never enough evidence to charge him. And while awaiting execution, Peter reportedly admitted to killing as many as 18 people. After his execution, his body was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere within the grounds of Barlinnie Prison. In 2018, a man approached the BBC to clear his name over a murder he'd been linked to 13 years earlier. But instead, it exposed years of ignored allegations against him and helped lead to his arrest. This is the case of Iain Packer. 27-year-old Emma Caldwell was last seen alive on CCTV at around 11 p.m. on the 4th of April 2005. She was walking alone along Butterbiggins Road in Glasgow towards Victoria Road. Emma had deeply struggled following the death of her sister from cancer and had eventually turned to drugs, later moving out of the family home and turning to sex work to fund her addiction. When her family couldn't reach her, they reported her missing on the 11th of April. Weeks later, on the 8th of May, Emma's body was discovered in Limefield Woods, near Biggar in South Lanarkshire, a remote woodland miles away from Glasgow. She had been stripped naked and a cable ligature had been tied around her neck. One end of the cable had been burned. It seemed like a small detail at first, but it was something that helped initially tie the suspect to the crime. As detectives investigated Emma's final movements, one of her friends told police about an obsessive client that Emma had been terrified of. She claimed he had previously raped Emma after taking her behind billboards in an isolated area. She also described how he would aggressively speed up in his van whenever he saw other men approaching her. And then came a breakthrough. A van matching the description given by Emma's friend was identified, an Alpha Beta Signs van, and one detective immediately noticed something unusual. Before joining the police, he had spent 10 years working as a neon signs draftsman and designer. Because of that background, he recognised the burned cable found on Emma's body as something commonly linked to neon sign repairs. The driver of that van was Iain Packer, but when questioned, Iain denied everything. He claimed he didn't know Emma, and he denied using sex workers altogether, lies he would later admit he told out of fear. Police then showed his photograph to women working in Glasgow's red light district. Multiple women immediately recognised him as a regular client, some saying he appeared almost daily. One woman described waking up to find Iain silently sitting on the edge of her bed, simply staring at her. She also accused him of rape. More and more women came forward with disturbing allegations of sexual violence, but instead of being treated as victims, some said that police threatened them with arrest for prostitution. The warnings about Iain Packer simply weren't taken seriously. Eventually, detectives began asking the women whether Iain had ever taken them to remote locations for sex, and at least 4 of the women said yes. One woman even led officers directly to a secluded spot where she said Iain had once forced her to strip naked. That location was just meters away from where Emma's body had been found. And despite that, despite women describing the same isolated area, despite Emma being found naked there, and despite Iain himself eventually admitting during his 4th police interview that he had taken Emma to the woods, senior detectives still refused to treat him as a suspect. According to officers involved in the case, one senior detective even said, "It doesn't matter what Iain Packer says." Instead, this investigator became fixated on a 76-second phone call that Emma had received from a Turkish man on the night that she disappeared. The investigation shifted entirely towards 2 Turkish men, with police eventually bugging a cafe in an attempt to tie them to the murder. But eventually, the case completely collapsed because there simply wasn't enough evidence. After years of dead ends, the investigation had effectively gone nowhere. Then came the twist that nobody expected. In 2018, Iain Packer approached the BBC himself, wanting to clear his name and give his version of events. He admitted that he lied to police about ever knowing Emma and even using sex workers, but claimed he had nothing to do with the murder. But as the team dug deeper into his past, a terrifying pattern began emerging. Women described repeated violence, rape, strangulation, and coercive control. One pregnant woman claimed that Iain held her captive inside a property for 2 weeks, taking her phone away and once holding a knife to her while she genuinely believed he was about to kill her. In total, 22 women eventually came forward with allegations of physical and sexual violence spanning over 25 years. Many described the exact same behaviour. If Iain didn't get what he wanted, he would become violent. Some said he even strangled them. All of the evidence that had once been ignored was finally impossible to overlook. On the 24th of February 2022, nearly 2 decades after first being identified as a suspect in Emma Caldwell's death, Iain Packer was eventually arrested. At trial, the judge described Emma's final moments in chilling detail, saying, "Whether she had threatened to report you to the police, or whether you killed her whilst acting out some evil fantasy, you murdered her in circumstances which must have been truly terrifying." Iain Packer was ultimately convicted of 32 charges involving violent and sexual crimes against women over a 25-year period, including 11 rapes and multiple sexual assaults involving 22 victims. Iain Packer was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. one of the longest sentences ever handed down in Scottish legal history. Court in Scotland made history after ruling that a man's abuse was so severe it played a significant role in driving his wife to take her own life. This is the case of Lee Milne. Kimberly Bruce and Lee Milne first met online in late 2021, and less than a year later, the pair married in September 2022. But behind closed doors, the relationship had already become deeply abusive. During the trial, the court heard that from January 2022 right up until Kimberly's death in July 2023, Lee subjected her to relentless physical and emotional abuse. He seized her by the neck and restricted her breathing. He punched her repeatedly in the head and body, and on some occasions, he beat her until she lost consciousness. The abuse became so severe that Kimberly reportedly slept with a knife under her pillow. But the abuse wasn't only physical. Lee regularly shouted at Kimberly, swore at her, belittled her, and called her names. He attempted to isolate her from her family and controlled her movements by restricting her access to money and transport. The court also heard that he would sometimes lock her inside their apartment without any food. Kimberly's sister later revealed that she had begged her to leave Lee just months before her death. But according to the evidence heard in court, Lee had threatened to kill himself if Kimberly ever left him, placing even more emotional pressure on someone who was already living in fear. Then came the 27th of July 2023. By this point, Kimberly and Lee had separated, but CCTV captured the pair together throughout the day in Dundee. The judge later highlighted that Lee knew Kimberly was already in a distressed and vulnerable state, yet footage showed him continuing to shout and yell at her inside a supermarket, even throwing items towards her. CCTV also showed Lee driving erratically with Kimberly inside the vehicle, and at one point, he even drove the car towards her before swerving away at the last second. Then, just moments later, Kimberly climbed the barrier of a road bridge and tragically fell to her death. She was only 28 years old. During sentencing, the judge stated that Kimberly had reached the point of complete despair and that Lee's prolonged abuse had been a significant contributing factor in her death. The case became the first of its kind in Scottish legal history, with jurors being asked to determine whether someone could be held criminally responsible for driving their partner to suicide through sustained domestic abuse. They found Lee Milne guilty of domestic abuse and culpable homicide. In April 2026, Lee Milne was sentenced to an extended sentence of 11 years. 8 of which are to be served in prison, followed by 3 years on licence. But disturbingly, this hadn't been the end of his crimes. Lee went on to SA 2 young boys, aged 10 and 11, during the summer of 2024. He was convicted on 2 separate offences and placed on the sex offenders register. Kimberly's family described her as 1 in a million, and said that they remain completely devastated by her loss. Although it's not clear where he's currently held, at the time of the proceedings, Lee Milne was being held on remand inside Barlinnie Prison. If you or somebody you know is experiencing domestic abuse, please know that support is available. Reaching out for help can feel incredibly difficult, but there are people and organisations trained to listen, support, and help keep you safe. Always seek help. This next inmate bragged about murder as though he was on a high after another man was found beaten to death inside his own home. But even after being jailed for the killing, the violence didn't stop. This is the case of Anthony Allen. 28-year-old Ryan Richardson was described by his family as a much-loved son, brother, and father to 3 young children. Ryan had struggled with addiction later in life, something that sadly became part of the backdrop to his death. But despite those struggles, his family never stopped caring about him, So when they suddenly stopped hearing from him for over a week, alarm bells immediately started ringing. Officers were eventually sent to Ryan's flat in Shettleston in Glasgow, where they made a devastating discovery. Ryan was found dead in his living room. Investigators determined he had been attacked while he was asleep. The injuries were horrific. Ryan's skull had been fractured into 17 separate pieces after at least 6 heavy blows to the head, believed to have been inflicted using a baseball bat or something similar. He had also suffered bleeding on the brain, with experts comparing the level of trauma to injuries typically seen in serious car crashes or falling from a height. Police believed Ryan had been killed sometime between the 3rd and the 15th of March 2019. As detectives investigated, suspicion eventually fell on Anthony Allen, a man that Ryan knew well and had regular contact with. Once the news of Ryan's death began appearing in the media, witnesses later claimed that Anthony started openly talking about the murder. One man told court Anthony appeared almost euphoric, repeatedly saying, "I did it, I did it." Prosecutors believe the motive was linked to drug debt. Anthony Allen already had a history of violence, including previous offences involving offensive weapons and threats to kill. Eventually, Anthony Allen was convicted of Ryan Richardson's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged the devastation caused to Ryan's loved ones, stating, "No sentence I can impose can possibly make up for what they have lost." But even behind bars, inside Barlinnie Prison, Anthony Allen's violence continued. Just 4 months into his sentence, on the morning of the 5th of July 2020, Anthony attacked one of Ryan Richardson's friends, James McGoy. According to reports, Anthony approached James on the prison exercise yard and placed an arm around him as though he was about to give him a hug, but concealed in his hand was a sharp piece of glass. Without warning, he slashed James across the neck and cheek. The two men then began fighting before prison officers rushed in to break it up. James required 27 stitches in total and was left permanently scarred from the attack. Anthony later pleaded guilty, claiming he believed that James was planning to attack him and that he struck first to protect himself. A sheriff imposed a further 21-month sentence for the prison attack, although no additional prison time was added beyond his existing life sentence. One inmate held inside Barlinnie Prison was convicted over the deadliest terror attack in British history. This is the case of Abdelbaset al-Megrahi. On the evening of the 21st of December 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 departed from London Heathrow, bound for New York. On board were 259 passengers and crew, many of them heading home for Christmas. But less than 40 minutes after takeoff, disaster struck. A bomb hidden inside a suitcase detonated in the cargo hold while the aircraft flew over the town of Lockerbie in Scotland. The explosion tore the plane apart mid-air, sending wreckage crashing down onto homes, streets, and fields below. Everyone on board was killed. But the devastation didn't end there. Large sections of the aircraft crashed directly into Lockerbie itself, destroying homes and killing 11 residents on the ground. In total, 270 people lost their lives in what remains the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on British soil. Eventually, suspicion centred around 2 Libyan intelligence officers, one of them being Megrahi. Prosecutors alleged that Megrahi had helped orchestrate the bombing by placing the suitcase bomb onto the aircraft. After years of political negotiations and legal disputes, Megrahi was eventually tried before a specially convened Scottish court in the Netherlands in 2000. In 2001, he was convicted of 270 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Following his conviction, Megrahi was transferred to Scotland and spent time imprisoned within Barlinnie, but the case remained deeply controversial. Over the years, Questions continued to surround aspects of the investigation, the evidence used at trial, and whether Megrahi had acted alone. Then in 2009, Megrahi was controversially released from prison on compassionate grounds after being diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. This decision sparked international outrage, particularly from many of the victims' families and politicians in the United States who believed the man convicted of Britain's deadliest terror attack should never have been released. Megrahi returned to Libya, where scenes of celebration during his arrival caused even further anger around the world. He ultimately died in 2012. This final inmate claimed self-defense, but the victim's injuries weren't consistent with his claims. This is the case of Gavin Gallagher. On the evening of the 3rd of November 2023, at around 7 p.m, emergency services were called to a block of flats on Southcroft Street in Glasgow after reports that a man had been seriously injured. When officers arrived, they found 23-year-old Stephen Gray suffering from devastating injuries. Despite efforts to save him, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators would later learn that Gavin Gallagher had attacked Stephen using boiling water mixed with sugar, something that can make burns even more severe by causing the liquid to cling to the skin for longer. Stephen had been bare-chested at the time, and Gavin admitted during questioning that he intended maximum damage. But the violence didn't stop there. Gavin then stabbed Stephen twice with a large kitchen knife. One of the wounds pierced directly through his chest and into his heart, causing catastrophic bleeding. The injury was later described in court as unsurvivable. Gavin immediately began claiming he had acted in self-defense. He told officers that Stephen had arrived armed with a knife. Gavin even placed his weapon beside Stephen's dying body, before repeatedly insisting to anyone that would listen that he'd been forced to defend himself. According to Gavin, both men had been at the flat earlier in the day, along with several others, before Stephen allegedly became angry and stormed out. Gavin claimed that Stephen later returned while he was alone in the flat. He said he looked through the peephole and saw that Stephen was holding a knife, so he armed himself with both a kitchen knife and a kettle of boiling water, supposedly intending only to scare him off. Gavin then claimed that as soon as he opened the door, Stephen charged towards him while lunging with the knife, forcing him into what he described as fight or flight mode. But detectives quickly found problems with his version of events. Gavin claimed he'd thrown the boiling water at Stephen as he ran towards him face first. Yet forensic evidence showed that the majority of Stephen's burns were actually across his back, injuries that simply didn't match the story that Gavin was telling. Investigators also questioned a second stab wound found above Stephen's eye, something Gavin struggled to explain. Gavin called 999 himself and insisted he'd felt guilty every day since the attack, but prosecutors argued that the evidence painted a very different picture, one of a sustained and deliberate attack, not a panicked act of self-defense. As the investigation continued, jurors also heard that Gavin Gallagher already had a history of violence and weapons offences prior to Stephen's murder. Ultimately, the jury rejected his self-defense claims entirely. Gavin Gallagher was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. Although it's unclear where Gavin Gallagher is currently imprisoned, he was being held inside Barlinnie at the time of sentencing, a prison that housed serial killers, terrorists, violent offenders, and some of Scotland's most dangerous criminals.